Welcome back to This Is Working. I'm your host, LinkedIn's editor-in-chief, Dan Roth. We are live in the Empire State Building. This Is Working is a show where we talk to leaders who have a significant impact on how we work and how we live. Today, our guest is Bill Gates. The COVID-19 pandemic turned our lives upside down, all while ushering in a whole new era of digitization. The level of technological adaptation that we've seen in 2 years of living with this virus typically takes decades to happen organically. That's something Bill Gates has put a lot of thought into and that he writes about in his newest book, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic. The co-founder of Microsoft, LinkedIn's parent company, was one of the first to join us on This Is Working remotely, just a couple weeks into countrywide lockdowns. Back then, he had predictions for us. He said virtual business meetings were here to stay, but he had his doubts about online schooling. What he didn't see was the fundamental shift in how professionals would view work, putting purpose and personal priorities before the job, something that we call the Great Reshuffle. Now Gates is at it again, looking into the future, and has advice for how workers and employers can navigate these new times. Bill, welcome back to This Is Working.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So when we talked last, April 2020, the pandemic had really descended. We were all trying to figure out how long it was going to last, how we're going to get out of it. One of the things that you had mentioned was that there were about 100 vaccines and therapeutics that were in the works, 8 to 10 of which you found to be really promising and that which the Gates Foundation would be backing. I'd love to understand how those investments panned out.
Well, the vaccine ended up getting out even faster than I expected. Wasn't a perfect vaccine. It didn't stop you from getting infected. And the duration is short enough that we're having to do a lot of boosters to maintain the protection against severe disease. But the vaccine, I'd give the world close to an A on how that came together, including ramping up the production worldwide. The therapeutics were a big disappointment. We've had some antibodies, but they've been hard to get to people in time. We now have a couple quite good antivirals, including Pfizer's Paxlovid that is starting to save lives. But I expected more in the therapeutic area. We just hadn't built up enough libraries. We didn't have the right trial organization. So I'd give us a much worse grade on that.
And how do you think about where, at the time, it felt like you were, that the Gates Foundation was spreading its investments, was placing bets across all these. If you could go back now, would you have made different decisions about where to put your investments?
Well, certainly. I mean, this pandemic has provided us a lot of lessons. Our foundation spent an extra $2 billion focused on the pandemic. Maybe a third of those grants had no impact. A few, like ramping up vaccine production in India through Serum, had a dramatic impact that 300 million alone would have justified the entire spending. The antibodies had very modest benefit. They're very hard to give out, particularly in poor countries. One of our therapeutics, dexamethasone, which is a late-stage anti-steroidal drug, that actually did save a number of lives. The oxygen centers we built out in a lot of countries, that was very worthwhile. So it's a mixed bag, but if your advantage over governments is that you can move faster, you're often going to be getting grants with very little information.
So I'm just thinking from a post-mortem point of view, and I realize we're not in a post-mortem world yet, but do you change how you, for the next pandemic as it comes, whenever it comes, whatever it looks like, do you think you'll change how the foundation spends its money, or how it even looks at some of these possibilities?
Well, our foundation primarily works on diseases of poor countries that don't have a natural funding model. Diseases in rich countries, you've got government spending, you've got a market, people pay a lot of money for drugs that help out. And so I hope that pandemics, because they do affect rich countries, a lot of that infrastructure and preparation should be paid for by governments so that we can keep our focus on things like tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, and all the things that caused a child in a poor country to have over 30 times the risk of dying than a child in the United States or other rich countries. The biggest mistake in the pandemic was that we didn't spend money before it hit to have a team of people who'd practiced and thought through, okay, how do you get diagnostics rolled out? How do you communicate quarantine policies? A few countries moved quickly. And so, Australia has 10% the death rate that the United States has. And that's simply because of their quick response.
And so what do you think when you look at the videos coming out of China as an example? You look at these lockdowns in Shanghai, coming to Beijing, and the impact it's been having on citizens, people pushing back against this, even in China. What kind of lessons should the world look to from China to say, like, this is how you handle COVID-0? Are they doing it right? What's your take on this?
Well, until the Omicron wave came along, it looked like a centrally controlled authoritarian country like China could prevent the infection spreading. Now that we've got this super transmissive variant, even for them, they're having a tough time blocking that spread. And so, Australia, which could enforce quarantine to some degree, but nothing like China, they really had the best of both worlds. They avoided the big case numbers, then they got their vaccine rate up, and then once Omicron hits, they do loosen up a bit, but the deaths were never super high because the elderly were protected with 2 or 3 doses of high quality vaccines. China is now faced with rushing to get that vaccination level up because at some point the cost of trying to avoid Omicron spreading is just going to be too high.
But they seem to be accepting the cost right now in terms of human lockdowns. And I think that at least, in your book, you really spell out incredibly well. And you've talked a little bit about this, about what role government should play, what role the scientific community should play. But I think that a lot of us, or at least I'm speaking for myself, I don't think that we expected the human element to factor in so much here, that the anger, the resentment, the pushback, the division that happened as people were dealing with any of the COVID restrictions or the requirements. How have you been surprised at all, or were you surprised over the last couple of years at how people responded to the requirements coming to them from government or from the pushback on contact tracing or contact tracing? Do you think about that at all, and how does that play into how we react to the next pandemic?
Well, a country like the U.S. will never be able to, impose extreme quarantine. I am surprised that are communicating to all the different, parts of the political spectrum. We didn't have trusted leaders so that the entire population could find someone that they trusted who was saying, look, the masks are going to save lives. Getting the vaccination rate, particularly in the elderly, up, that's going to make a big difference. There were mistakes made. I mean, the understanding of, were lockdowns worth the benefit, particularly things like school lockdowns, where now we have these huge educational gaps. That should be debated because there's a huge trade-off there. It was much worse in terms of the polarization and the discussion imputing strange motives to people like myself or Tony Fauci. I didn't see that coming, and the remedy to that is not as clear as making a fantastic vaccine or a cheap diagnostic that you can scale up very rapidly.
But doesn't it play into how we react to the next pandemic? I mean, is there something that we need to factor in? And maybe this is part of the core of people who are thinking about the next pandemic, is assuming that there will be divisions and polarization. Or do you think that was uniquely true to this particular pandemic?
I think it was true partly because we were faced with such an awful set of circumstances. My recommendations in the book would mean that very few outbreaks would go global. And so the US is unlikely to be ground zero. We don't have that many places where we're invading nature or close to animals like you'd find in Africa or in Asia. And so it should be worth a lot to us to help them have the capacity to stop it before it gets global. That's why I literally say in the title that we can stop from something from becoming a pandemic. It's just an outbreak, and then this team of experts at WHO, I call it GERM, Global Epidemic Response and Mobilization, they would make sure you go and wipe it out before it's getting to the entire world.
Yeah, one of the things you talk when you're sketching that out in the book, one of the things you talk about is the more successful you are at wiping it out or at preventing it in a community, the more pushback there might be from the community because they're like, well, why do we have to do all these restrictions when none of this actually happened? You told me to put on masks, you told me to quarantine, and no one I know got sick. So therefore, this was all a false alarm. I mean, isn't that a problem?
Yeah, no, it's definitely paradoxical that the painful steps you take to avoid the disaster, are our building codes too strong? Because that's a lot of money. Maybe the earthquake never comes. Do we overfund fire prevention? Because we do such a good job. The number of deaths from fire are way, way down. And so we do count on government to think ahead about tornadoes or pandemics and get experts to come together. The good news on the pandemic is the investment level required to be ready is very small. $1 billion a year at the global level. Then some of these R&D things which will have non-pandemic applications. So compared to something huge like the military budget or what we have to do to avoid climate change, this is pretty modest. And this year, I hope my book, kicks off the debate while we still have in mind that the price for not stopping these things before they become pandemics is absolutely gigantic.
I'd love to talk about businesses' reaction, how this has changed how we work. You famously, in the early days, would memorize the license plates of people who worked at Microsoft so that you could see when people showed up and when they left. One of the things that feels like we've learned from this pandemic is that, in fact, we don't have to go to the office. Actually, I'd be curious, do you think that is one of the lessons from this?
Certainly for a lot of activities, a lot of the time, you don't need to be in the office. And even to me, we're all this digital stuff, Skype, Teams, Microsoft's been a leader. I was impressed by how much we could get done on a global basis. The foundation, operated at full speed, even though, I haven't been to those offices now for a little bit over 2 years.
Wow. So do you think that we go back, or is this the new normal?
I think the amount of experimentation going on is really great. I think there's only a few organizations that will go 100% virtual, but I think a lot could say, okay, we have 1 week out of 4 that we expect people to be available for face-to-face meetings. I think a lot of organizations are doing something that's too modest in my view, which is saying, okay, Mondays and Fridays you can work from home. That seems not to capture the full benefit of flexibility. Then you have to be in that city because you're going in every week. And you're also, because all the companies are still coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the kind of traffic is the same. You can't share offices.
Right.
So those offices are idle some of the time. I applaud the companies that are really trying out very different models. I think young people are more open-minded. I think in some ways managers are less open-minded, but a lot of experiments are being run. And it's interesting to talk to people like if you were a new employee at the foundation during the pandemic, how was that experience versus those of us who really knew each other from the history of face-to-face interaction. And, can you take more than meetings just casually hanging around and create some digital equivalent of that? Really a lot of investment going in to make these tools better.
So what are you finding? Are new employees at the foundation able to form the same kind of bonds, or do you think that they are at a disadvantage?
We have to do something uh, that's a little bit that happens naturally when you're in an office, and it's a little bit unnatural in that digital thing to get groups together to just talk informally, or after a meeting to have some group that says, hey, is that a typical meeting, or was that one particularly tough, and did everybody get the right message? You can see when you walk out of a meeting people kind of clustering together and
Right.
kind of making sure they go away with the right understanding. We don't have digital equivalents for the water cooler, for just hanging out at the end of the day, and so I think we can make digital very close for jobs where you're not actually physically building things.
All right, we are here at This Is Working with Bill Gates. I want to give a shout out to some folks who are joining in on the stream right now. We've got Rahul Alod, a Microsoft escalation manager from India. Welcome. Brad Westerman, a longtime Microsoft engineer from Florida, and Gio Mar, a lab tech from Ecuador. So people joining from all around the world. I'd love to stick with the foundation for a minute. There's a line in your book, it's almost a throwaway line, where you talk about a kind of an easy to administer needle that has been used to help eradicate childhood diseases. And you mentioned in the book that that needle that was very hard to get because it was being used in the last 2 years to help administer vaccines, which I assume means that kids were not getting inoculated against other diseases beyond COVID. Would you spell out, like, what has been the impact of, as COVID has sucked in investment and attention from the world, what other diseases that you have been focused on, what other problems have not gotten the attention or the investment that they should have?
Well, in developing countries, getting those vaccines out is super important. That's how you stop measles and diarrhea. And we've fallen behind. And for Africa, that gap in health service has led to more deaths than even COVID directly. And now the economic effects there are also very tough because they didn't have the big government aid programs that rich countries, particularly the US, were able to put into place. Now, when you look at the hangover of the pandemic in terms of these deficits, and with Ukraine being a big focus and very expensive in terms of defense costs and electricity costs, I do worry that we'll never get that catch up, particularly in Africa.
And are you seeing it in the numbers? Are you seeing?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of a lot of vaccination sessions were canceled because they were worried that that gathering would spread the disease. And now that we look back on it, we could have done that safely. But some of the personnel were off working on other things. So it may take us 2 years before we even get back to the level we were at before the pandemic.
So are you worried about global health issues and energy breakthroughs in an even greater way than you were before the pandemic? Have we set back the world because of this?
We didn't slow down the innovation. So their investment money and good ideas in that energy space, where my efforts are under the breakthrough energy label, that actually did go full speed ahead, and I'm very excited about the work there. Even in medicines, having this vaccine platform, mRNA, and understanding infection a bit better, so that also went forward very quickly. Government budgets and debt levels, that's where I worry that anytime there's a distraction, it's the low-income countries that end up paying the price for that. Fertilizer, wheat, everything's more expensive. In the end, somebody doesn't get it. The shortage isn't just a higher price, it's some people priced out altogether. And sadly, that'll be a very negative impact on Africa. and the capacity to help out with aid will be reduced because of all the attention and resources that, somewhat appropriately are going to this war that we didn't expect.
So the foundation changes its focus or investments because of that, or not?
Well, for us, global health is the big priority. We're going to help participate in getting some good pandemic preparation in place. Although in the long run, that's got to be government funded. We'll try and help out with better seeds that, in some cases you don't need as much fertilizer. Our general focus, helping poor countries as the biggest thing, and then education as our second biggest thing, that remains the same.
Got it. And when you talk about, you and Melinda have gotten divorced, but you're still both active in the foundation. How does that work? How do you work together? What kind of lessons are there for others who are trying to do something similar?
Well, we've, throughout last year, which was tough in a lot of ways, we kept working together. Our views on the values of the foundation and the great people we hire and our ability to drive innovation. We've been part of cutting childhood death in half. We've been able to take the Microsoft resources and Warren Buffett's resources and get them out to save tens of millions of lives. So, I'm glad that, that partnership remains intact. In fact, it never really faced any difficulties, and I enjoy having her as a partner in that.
Has it changed any of the processes, or have you guys learned to work differently or in a new way? I feel like there's so much of us in the professional world, whether you're married to someone or whether you just have to get along with someone that you don't get along with, but you still have a common interest or a common set of goals. You got to learn to work with people. I don't know if there's any lesson in this from you two.
Well, we have to be more explicit about brainstorming before meetings. That would sort of come naturally, just as you're doing normal walks. It's one of the topics come up. Now we look out at the next few weeks and say, okay, is this meeting, where they're asking for more headcount or change of strategy? How do we see that? Are we ready to make that decision? Do we see it the same way? So that's a tiny bit more formal, but we're so used to brainstorming about strategy and building teams with the right set of skills. That's my full-time work. It's her full-time work. We'd really miss not having that.
So still speaking the same language, basically.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've seen on LinkedIn during the pandemic is a rise in the kind of conversations, a change in the kind of conversations that professionals have. One really interesting one that has absolutely kind of dominated the trending topics in the last few years has been mental health. Mental health in the workplace. This was not a conversation that was sort of an accepted conversation among managers, between managers and employees. It feels like things have changed. And I'm wondering whether you've seen any of that, whether you've noticed it, what you think about the rise in people being, especially at work, talking about mental health as a topic.
I'm not an expert on this. I know that the stress and strain of the pandemic, was tough in all workplaces. You had particularly women who were trying to balance all the things they were doing, and were men stepping up to help with those things? Was that an overload for them? And, in the extreme case, that can, really hurt your mental health. And so, I hope, I know a lot of meetings, we'd start off and say, how are you? What's going on with you? I learned a lot more about people's family situations to try and make sure that where they had demands there, we weren't asking them to work harder than they should. So, just general care about work-life balance. I think that awareness is very helpful. I do think there's been a trend to be more open about, hey, I'm, stressed out, or I have some particular problem. I think that's a constructive trend.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people who are just getting into the workplace now? People who are just figuring out, they're getting out of college. They've had the last couple of years have been their education maybe is changed, how they deal with people has changed. They're trying to figure out how to make it and work. What's your advice you give these days?
Well, you really have to think in your work, are you doing it in a steady state way? And what part of the job do you enjoy? And what parts don't you enjoy? And if you think about, over time, are you getting yourself into a position that, it's mostly the good stuff? I don't think there's any job that's, completely all the fun stuff. Some personnel things just are necessary, but not going to be the joyful part of work. For me, the political side is important, but if I had to do that over half the time, and I didn't have the piece connected up with innovation and teams of innovators and seeing those things get out in the field, I don't think I'd get re-energized to do the job overall. And so thinking explicitly about your needs, what renews you, telling your coworkers things they do that are draining your energy. I'm glad that people are open-minded to those conversations, even telling me, did I make their job particularly fulfilling, or do they feel like it's pushing them harder than they want to, so they might face burnout issues.
Yeah, you like getting that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I'm so much more mellow now than I was, 20 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago when I'm CEO of Microsoft and it seems like there's not a minute to waste, I don't think at the end of the meeting that somebody had said to me, hey, that was a stressful meeting. And I would have said, okay, let's just sit around and talk about that.
Right.
That's really important to me. So, as I've gotten older and stepped back, I'm not on the front lines of doing things now. And, I do help assemble teams. I've seen, if you push too hard, that's often counterproductive. So yes, I think, it's somewhat in line with the times that I'm, the long-term capabilities and what you contribute is way more important than the short term.
So if you could go back 20 years and tell the Bill Gates CEO to ask those kind of questions, to chill out, to find out, leave some space for the discussions about how people are doing, would you, or do you think that you did it right for the time?
Well, within the engineering teams, we selected for a certain type of individual, and we were able to build incredible teams. As I was working with the sales teams or other teams, some of those shortcomings probably held things back. It's hard, when things work as well as they did, it's hard to say, oh yeah, I could have done that in kumbaya. The intensity selected for a certain type of person, and we missed out on other people's talents. My foundation work, we need such a mix of talents. It's not just, day and night coders and we'll blow the competition away just with our software.
Right. All right. I want to read, we have a bunch of questions coming in. I know we don't have a ton of time left with you, but I want to get a couple of these. James from Montreal asks, how is the Gates Foundation invested in fighting disinformation for COVID-19?
Well, we have a history with the polio eradication campaign of looking at why people are refusing to take vaccines. In Nigeria, there was a rumor that it was sterilizing women, and we said, okay, who do those people trust? In that case, it was the religious leaders. And so having them visibly vaccinate their children and say, look, this is good for my daughters. And, we had time, and that was successful. We eventually got rid of wild polio in Nigeria, despite those headwinds. So understanding those trust networks is very important. And, during the pandemic, that broke down.
Got it. And MJ, a New York education director, asks, how can we support parents in teaching children about health safety?
Well, hopefully you can make health an interesting topic. And, here, sadly, we have examples of, where, infection gets in and gets to an elder person, so there's a lot at stake of good practice, trying not to, to spread infection. I hope, kids are interested in these things, and, you can find people who explain it and make it simple. I love medicine. We're getting smarter all the time.
Well, years ago, I know you did an energy breakthrough focus just for kids. So on the high school kids in particular, maybe there's a version of this for, how to stop the next pandemic just for kids. I'm not sure if you're thinking along those lines.
Yeah, we need to get it into the curriculum.
Right. Okay. Bill Gates, thank you so much for stopping by today. It has been great talking to you. Good luck with the new book. So glad you wrote it. And thanks for all of you've been doing on LinkedIn. Your newsletter is worth reading. Everyone subscribe to that newsletter. And we will see you here hopefully before the next 2 years.
Fantastic.
Thanks. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today. We publish all of this as a podcast and as a newsletter, which is also called This Is Working. The link should be on the screen right now. So you should go and subscribe to that. You can make sure you get this in your inbox and as a notification on LinkedIn. Thank you to everyone. We will see you soon. Stay strong.